Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is What If Naruto Got Harem with Uchiha Clan's Girls Part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic, then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. First of all, you really should check out my profile page, since there are a few things I strongly dislike in the setting, and in a sense, represent my collected thoughts on a lot of those things can be found there. I wouldn't want you to go into this with false expectations of what awaits you. You have returned from taking a look at my profile page. Good. There are a few more things I have to mention that are relevant to the story. The premise of this story is heavily inspired by A Dark Obsession by Sabaku Ukami. All of you who know the story should be aware that this story will start out pretty dark, touching strongly upon themes like mind control, mind rape, and slavery, although I'm not sure how detailed the descriptions will turn out. A Dark Obsession never progressed past a certain point, but what I think was reasonable to expect, in case it would have. What it doesn't feature is self-harm or suicidal thoughts and tendencies, small mercies, I know. For all of you who don't know, A Dark Obsession, the cliff notes are the following. Makoto runs into Naruto and ends up obsessing over him, therefore the title smiley face, and she tries to provide him with the life she thinks he deserves. For that goal, she takes out the majority of the Uchiha clan, and the remaining members, virgin girls not past a certain age, she takes with her and Naruto as his servants. This story will have some parallels to that. What this story won't do is have Makoto and Naruto flee the village as it occurred in A Dark Obsession. Let's be clear. If she would have done that, Konoha, and the moment other villages learned Konoha Jinchurikis, a little boy, is out there ready to be grabbed, the whole world would be looking for them. Therefore the entire thing would essentially be unfeasible. It is one thing as an S or a rank shinobi to survive under those conditions. However, it is something entirely different if you have genin, academy students, and a young untrained Naruto along for the ride. Furthermore, this story will use my rules for the Sharingan, as stated in my profile page, and heavily feature them in the first few chapters. This means I will make use of one of the early instances we see of the Susanoo, where it is shown to possess 4 eye sockets, and in the case of the Mangekyo Sharingan, with 2 being closed and empty. So in order to get an eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, you will need to offer up another set of Mangekyo Sharingan to your Susanoo, which then fills up those empty eye sockets with those eyes, thereby creating one set of eternal Mangekyo Sharingan. This eliminates the eye swap that is quite prominent in this fandom, thus allowing for a clear divide between the Mangekyo Sharingan and eternal Mangekyo Sharingan eyes, which canon doesn't provide. The only difference is the number of previous owners, and it also, since eye swapping is not possible, creates an underlying greed and evil theme for people pursuing an EMS, since the swap to me always felt like a loophole taking away from the Uchiha curse of hatred. In addition to this, I will use the premise of another story called Infinite Sharingan by Arthur Hansen. It is a story that takes the idea of Naruto's healing ability, which allowed him to regenerate having a fist through one of his lungs, to its logical conclusion. It allows for the regeneration of body parts, including the eyes. Both of those premises have incredible potential. Unfortunately, I have yet to see either one being used aside from those stories. You might have noticed, but I'm usually not a fan of Naruto having the Sharingan. A descendant of the Senju, Uzumaki and Uchiha should always end up with a Rinnegan from the start, and as I mention on my profile page, Rinnegan shouldn't have been a stage in the Sharingan development. It should always have been its own unrelated dojutsu. Even so, for the second premise to work as needed for this story, Naruto will have a Sharingan. The reason he didn't get a Rinnegan is rooted in the way he got the Sharingan in the first place, which boils down to essentially not allowing his Senju, Uzumaki and Uchiha DNA parts to fuse to create the Rinnegan and instead kept them separate, which at the moment I have no intention of changing throughout the course of the story. However, Naruto's Sharingan will be different and follow its own rules, and it might have one or two aspects of the Rinnegan in some fashion. You'll see what I mean by that eventually. I think I have bored you long enough with some drivel, so without further ado. This chapter was edited by Praterkson. Chapter 01. Fateful Meeting. I was on my way to the academy, feigning irritation at Kasumi and her apparent lack of skill, to fetch Sayuri in her place. For a Chunin engaged in a friendly sparring match, not noticing the change in the trajectory of a kunai coming her way the very instant it was outside her field of vision was cause for concern. Although, I couldn't really complain, given how easy it was to injure my housekeeper and thus get her out of my way for the day. Then again, it hadn't really surprised me that since I married Fugaku and surrendered the clan leadership to him, I had noticed a steady decline in ability in our younger generation. It mostly stemmed from an unhealthy over-reliance on our eyes, with most of them just becoming mindless apes mimicking their opponents. Worst of all, many seemed to be proud of that fact, not realizing that a generation ago, being called a copycat was one of the gravest insults to people bearing the Uchiha crest. Yet, with the spark of genius that was once present in every single member of the clan being absent in most, it didn't surprise me. To be fair, this development didn't start with Fugaku, if the accounts of our clan history are to be believed. The clan's decline started back when we were entrusted with the security of the village and the founding of the Uchiha police force. This resulted in the clan, for the most part, being confined to the village, with only the occasional exception from within our ranks being allowed to join the shinobi forces proper for any length of time. This reduced the number of Uchiha whose mere existence could strike fear into the hearts of our enemies to a scant few, and it got rarer and rarer each year. Our clan, by now, was lazily resting upon the accomplishments of our forefathers. I was convinced that in a generation or two the Uchiha name would be said in the same breath as the Yamanaka or the Nara, the Uchiha falling beneath the recognition of even the four noble clans. The reverence of old would be a fading memory with the tale of the great shinobi wearing the Uchiha crest believed to be an exaggeration. Despite not sharing the misgivings of Fugaku and the elders, it was apparent that the clan's confinement was a measure taken by the second Hokage to keep us close. Some would call it a reasonable precaution, but there undoubtedly was reason to fear us. Madara made the fact of what one of us could accomplish should we put our minds to it more than evident. We are warriors first and foremost. Our place is on the battlefield, where we can feel at home amongst the carnage. Glorified guard dogs we are not. The Inuzuka would fit that bill better than we ever could. So it was no wonder that Madara, who spent every waking moment of his life on the battlefield, managed to get as strong as he did. Since Tobirama crossed blades with the Uchiha more than once, he must have been painfully aware of this fact. He knew better than to underestimate us, and by trying to keep us away from the fighting, he succeeded in stifling our growth, barring the rare exception. A sensible precaution, one it seemed he managed to instill in his successors before he got himself killed. As a result, even during times of war, the village leadership hardly called upon us to fight, and when they did, most of the time, it was because they had no other choice. It was a vastly different treatment than the Hyuga received, although they too had certain duties within the village. Perhaps Kushina was right when I had brought the matter up with her during our Chunin days that the unequal treatment was rooted in the fact they had chosen to safeguard their eyes while we hadn't. Unfortunately, her attempt to fix that went nowhere when I presented the seal she came up with to my father. Neither he nor the elders deemed it worth their time to fully hear me out, and they dismissed the whole concept out of hand, calling the Hyuga seal a flimsy excuse to justify slavery. Hypocrisy at its finest. What had made it worse was that by so doing, they had called into question Kushina's trustworthiness that the seal worked as described and had no hidden function. It didn't help that they had considered us the superior dojutsu-wielding clan of Konoha, which would have been enough on its own for them to reject the idea. Obviously, they couldn't have given the Hyuga the opportunity to lord something like copying them over us, ignoring the merits of my proposal entirely, despite our secret history of stealing eyes from one another in the pursuit of lasting power. Then again, the vehemence of their refusal had struck me as odd. A few years later, I had learned the real reason why they had refused. One of the duties of the clan head was harvesting and preserving the eyes of our dead, a secret I had never seen fit to inform Fugaku about, despite officially having handed over leadership of the clan to him. I had believed myself incapable of contending with the elders on a regular basis and had been sure that if they needled me enough, I wouldn't have been able to resist the temptation to rip their tongues out and put their heads on spikes. On second thought, the condescending looks I would have had to endure for being a woman ruling the clan, coupled with their constant offhand remarks wishing for my little brother to succeed me, would have ensured they wouldn't have survived the first month of my reign. Besides that, I could do well without the headache this would have created when their next of kin would have inevitably come complaining. Knowing that, by the time I was done expressing my displeasure, our clan probably wouldn't have counted more than 10 members. I have never been able to tolerate incompetence and stupidity around me for prolonged amounts of time, so not having to suffer through the elders' incessant nagging served me quite well. Although, I occasionally couldn't help wondering if the price I had paid for it had been worth it in the end. Arriving at the academy, I joined a cluster of other parents waiting for their kids to storm out of the gate. With nothing better to do, I allowed my eyes to wander. Besides, some parents or caretakers averted their gaze after seeing me. In some cases, they even went so far as unsubtly steering clear so as not to be seen associating with an Uchiha. I could understand the sentiment. Seeing your family being killed by what could only be described as a force of nature and then being unable to take their pound of flesh in retaliation was something many struggled with. Not knowing where to direct your righteous anger was even more so, and I would like nothing more than to give them a chance to sat their cravings for revenge. Unfortunately, in doing so, I would confirm what was currently considered nothing more than an unsubstantiated rumor, that the Uchiha clan was responsible for what happened. I highly doubted the general populace would care that cousin Obito had been reported dead years prior to that, nor that my investigation into the aftermath of the Kyuubi attack revealed that he hadn't had any contact with any of our kin living in the village. Still, I couldn't be sure he hadn't had anyone else backing him. Another Uchiha was unlikely, since there was only one other body that couldn't be recovered in the last 20 years. According to the reports, he had been killed by Onoki's dust release during the Second Shinobi World War. Given that Iwa hadn't flaunted an Uchiha clan of their own, I was inclined to believe the veracity of that report. No, the modification of his body pointed in an entirely different direction, and after I confirmed the validity of my theory, there would be a reckoning. It was only a matter of time. So when I had found Obito's dead body as I had been trying to reach Minato in order to help him, I had done what I had always been made to believe every reasonable member of a clan would have upon realizing that one of theirs had been responsible for destroying half the village. I had made the evidence disappear, thus marking the greatest regret of my life. If only I wouldn't have been required to follow what my father had ingrained into my head since I had been a child, and instead could have followed my heart. Then I could have been in time too. I stopped myself from going down that path again as I noticed an ANBU hiding on the roof of a house from where he was overlooking the crowd. He didn't bother hiding very well. Back in the day, Dragon would have had his hide for such a lack of skill. Luckily for him, it seemed I was the only one aware of his presence. Carefully maintained instincts put me on alert as I continued to scan my surroundings, searching for his teammates. It was rare for ANBU to operate alone, at least not for anything considered crucial. It was likewise rare for them to operate within the village bounds. I didn't have any time to wonder further what his presence was all about, as a horde of screaming children ran out of the building, searching for their parents. Sayuri had no trouble making me out amongst the people, the superior eyesight every Uchiha possessed even before the activation of the Sharingan showing its worth. She immediately hastened her pace and ran my way with a smile plastered on her face. Her face had more than just a passing resemblance to her father's, possessing the same eyes and cheekbones, but more importantly, she bought into the same Uchiha exceptionalism as her father, thinking herself to be better than everybody else. This sentiment had only been reinforced since her first day at the academy by becoming top of her class, to this day, a feat I wasn't entirely sure how she managed it. She was average at best, not even close to the skill her older sister called her own at half Sayuri's age. Surely nowhere near good enough to be labeled a genius, a term that had seen such excessive use it had seemingly lost all meaning. I couldn't recall a year in recent memory in which the top student in a class was called anything else. I missed the times when you actually had to back up such denominations, since there was nothing more dangerous than a contorted perception of your own ability. She was already buying into it all, and short of receiving a wake-up call, it would only get her killed sooner rather than later. Sayuri came to a stop right in front of me, her grin widening. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she asked while searching the crowd. "Where is Kasumi?" She hurt herself while training. "Nothing serious," I informed her. "Oh," she momentarily deflated, only for her grin to return with a vengeance. "I like you better, anyway. You can come to get me from now on if you like," before mumbling under her breath before she clarified. "Well, on those days Izumi Oni-chan can't. If it were up to me, I wouldn't mind being here every day, just not for her sake." As it stood, I was already taking a risk by being here. Nonetheless, it was a chance I had to take. I couldn't remain oblivious about his well-being. I needed to know that he was taken care of. "Unfortunately, that will not be possible," I told her, my words wiping the smile from her face. Taking on the same bland expression her father constantly wore on his face, thus further highlighting the similarities between her and the semen donor responsible for her existence. To be honest, I had never come to like either of my so-called offspring for the simple reason that they were also fugakus. Sayuri, in particular, with her mediocre talent, looks, and entitlement that made her a younger female version of her father, had made that rather difficult. Not that I could say I hadn't tried. But it had become clear rather early on, that the children I had to bear him would never be mine in any way that counted. I had merely been supposed to be the breeding cattle providing an immaculate lineage. The children had always been supposed to be his and his alone, to mold them as he had seen fit, in accordance with our agreement. As a result, after realizing this, I had ceased all attempts to bond with them on more than a superficial level. I hadn't even nursed them to prevent myself from getting attached. It hadn't been easy to stay away in the case of my firstborn. She had been gifted and intelligent, but most importantly, her features hadn't had any clearly discernible resemblance to her father, having been being a perfect melding of mine and his. It made her look like just another cousin, unlike Sayuri. There were moments when it had been hard to resist the temptation to nurture her spark instead of seeing it slowly doused in the mold Fugaku tried to press her into. Seeing him gradually destroy one of the scant few in our clan who had actually possessed some talent had been difficult to bear. Naturally, she had easily exceeded her peers despite being under his tutelage, not that it had been challenging by any measure. She most likely would have managed it lobotomized and blinded. The problem was that by helping her, I would have had to renege on the agreement that had freed me from any kind of responsibility of leading a withering clan in exchange for 2 children and playing the perfect wife, his very own Yamato Nadeshiko. It had come to me easily enough. The role had not been very demanding, especially since I hadn't had to suffer his touch, not that I had believed myself to be capable of it. The very thought of it had turned my stomach. His daughters, whom had merely been the product of impregnating myself with the semen he had provided, had been cut from my body by myself 9 months later. After my first meeting with a prospective husband, I had known that none of them could ever hope to come close to anything resembling what I might have had with Kushina and Minato, the only family I ever had. Since then, I hadn't been given a choice other than to follow the suggestion forced upon me. Koto Amatsukami, the sole genjutsu I hadn't been able to overcome. I had chosen the lesser evil in Fugaku. He at least hadn't been twice my age and had been amicable to accept my deal if it brought him the clan leadership. I probably should have considered myself lucky because if not for my progenitors, the word father does carry an implied closeness that hadn't existed between us. Lack of skill, and poorly worded instructions, the marriage would have been happily consummated. Any belief I might have held onto that this had been the result of a consideration on his part not to infringe on my mind, at least not any further than he absolutely had to, had been crushed just yesterday. He had overheard a reoccurring argument between me and Fugaku, during which Fugaku had expressed his displeasure about the two agreed upon children, both girls, and had demanded that we renegotiate the terms. My progenitor, realizing the loopholes he had left, had tried to rectify his mistake by attempting to use his eye on me again. I hadn't been able to break the compulsion he had already placed on me, but preventing a repeat had been well within my power. My rather violent objection had made sure of it, as I had taken his life in his eyes for myself. This had been an auspicious occasion since his eternal Mangekyo Sharingan had possessed the power to break any genjutsu, making it possible to remove my conditioning. As it turned out, it hadn't by far been the only instance he had used his eye on me to enforce a specific behavior. It had simply been that in all those other instances, he had thought it prudent to keep me from remembering, something he had decided to forego when he had compelled me to marry, to show me my place. It hadn't been until that moment that I had realized the full scope of how he had violated my mind over the years, how none of the decisions I had made throughout my life had truly been my own. It had also never occurred to me before that the reason I hadn't killed him and made him suffer for his actions could be rooted in another genjutsu placed on me years earlier. What had turned out to be his fatal mistake was not having altered how I perceived and reacted to threats, thus having allowed me to defend myself. Since I hadn't been keen for my mind to be played around with, I had considered him trying an attack upon my very being, as an attack on my life, and had reacted accordingly to it, using deadly force. I had been his puppet all along. An unwilling one for sure, who had fought against being manipulated using every loophole and trick imaginable, but a puppet, nonetheless. Every decision I had ever made had been influenced by his machinations. I had joined ANBU to spy on the village for him. My disinterest in leading the clan had stemmed from his not wanting me to be in charge. By marrying me off to somebody sharing his vision and making me hand over the clan leadership to my husband, he had avoided breaking the succession laws. Because without someone holding my strings, I had been bound to go against his vision of the Uchiha clan, eventually, something my proud entitled progenitor Kagami couldn't have allowed to happen, which was why my rebellious brother had never been deemed a suitable replacement for me either. Compared to what I had lost by being forced to marry Fugaku, the son he always wanted, this hadn't even registered. It had never been my hurt pride at coming in second place at winning Minato's affection, or jealousy, that had prevented me from sharing my life with the only two people I had ever truly loved, but another compulsion. The truly unforgivable act, however, had been forcing me to keep my status as Naruto's godmother a secret, and for allowing the village to take custody of him, the last living piece of Minato and Kushina left in the world. My progenitor had even seen fit, given my proclivity to find ways around his compulsion, to steer me clear of every location I could potentially run into him. He obviously hadn't wanted the village to see an Uchiha associating with the host of the Kyuubi, thus stoking the rumors. Sayuri, no longer disheartened by my words, took my hand in hers and tried to drag me away, a futile attempt. My feet would stay rooted in place until I accomplished what I came here to do as I continued to scan the crowd for a yellow mop of hair. I vividly remembered the single instance I had seen him from afar just moments after his birth and the death of his parents. Watching the third removing the newborn boy from the grasp of his dead parents had been the worst thing I had ever witnessed. The crushing guilt at arriving too late had been the worst feeling I had ever felt, and courtesy of the Sharingan was something I could never forget. The memory had burned itself into my mind to never fade away, and it had haunted my dreams ever since. Just as Sayuri got tired of pulling at my hand and opened her mouth to complain, I found what I was looking for. A patch of yellow blonde hair made its way through the crowd. I trained my eye on him and didn't waste a moment following him. Sayuri's mouth escaped a sudden yelp as I dragged her along. The people surrounding us only allowed me a few fleeting glances at him, for the most part blocking my view. Where are we going, Mom? Our house is that way. Sayuri saw fit to mention. As he reached the edge of the area, the boy's way was obstructed by 3 boys standing in a loose circle next to the academy railings talking to each other. Without hesitating, he pushed through, grazing the shoulder of one of the boys, a mumbled, "Sorry," on his lips. The boys took a moment to look at each other, and the big-boned kid I pegged as an Akamichi asked, "Was that?" Only to receive 2 nods in response. A sadistic grin was the unspoken signal for them to turn around and pursue Naruto running. I increased my pace and directed chakra to my eyes. Immediately my perception sharpened, and the world seemed to move in slow motion. The Sharingan helped me to navigate the maze of people without having to clear the obstacles in my way with force. When I cleared the crowd and turned into the same street, I saw the tail end of the 3 older boys having Naruto in a headlock and maneuvering him into a side street. My jog turned into a full sprint as I closed the distance, dragging along a stumbling Sayuri. When I reached the mouth of the alleyway, the 3 older boys had Naruto against the wall, surrounded on all 3 remaining sides. "Mom, what are we doing here?" Sayuri asked. Only after a few moments in which I didn't respond did she follow my view. "Huh, what is that idiot doing picking fights?" The grip of my hand around hers suddenly strengthened considerably, threatening to crush her fingers. It took her screaming out in pain and trying to free her hand for me to realize what I had done. I released her hand and saw from the corner of my eyes how Sayuri was nursing her hand. "That hurt," she wailed. I ignored her and instead focused on what was happening in the alleyway. "Let me go, you big jackasses," Naruto shouted. A hard shove against the wall stopped his attempts to push through the encirclement. Laughing, the brown-haired boy standing in front of Naruto said, "We might do that after you kneel before us and beg for forgiveness, demon brat." Neither he nor the 3rd boy with his moss-green hair seemed to belong to a clan, lacking any of the typical features associated with them. This in turn called my initial assumption for the big-boned kid to be an Akamichi into question. A clan child should know better than to mess with a Jinchuriki. That was a term for which it was hard to put my disdain into words because none of the 3 people I knew who had qualified for carrying that distasteful designation deserved to be called human sacrifice. More importantly, how did they even know about Naruto's status? Wasn't it forbidden to talk to kids about it? The ANBU from before shunshined on top of the wall the boys were standing next to, interrupting my thoughts. This could only mean one thing: that he was Naruto's protection detail. So far, I wasn't impressed with his performance. As pleased as I was at his presence for rendering my interference redundant should this get out of hand, it also complicated things. It prevented me from making contact with Naruto if I didn't want the Hokage and Danzo to know about it. Just being here might suffice for my name to appear in the mission report of that ANBU operative. Another foiled escape attempt from Naruto made them change their strategy. "Hold him," ordered the brown-haired boy. Naruto wasn't given a chance to react as the 2 remaining boys grabbed one of his arms each, holding him in place. "I'm really gonna enjoy this," he proclaimed as he took a loose stance and punched Naruto in the stomach. The hit from the older boy, who was a full head bigger and at least 2 years older than Naruto, made him retch in pain. The only thing stopping him from crumbling into a ball on the floor were the hands holding him upright. I balled my hands into fists, and my head tilted upwards, glaring at the ANBU operative. Since he hadn't intervened yet, I wondered what it would take for him to do so. Meanwhile, the brown-haired boy threw his second punch, a well-placed right hook that made Naruto sputter blood on the big-boned kid's shirt. "Hey, careful," he protested at his friend, taking a step to the side. "My bad," the brown-haired kid apologized, scratching the back of his head. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again. It's bad enough I have to touch him." Hearing this, I clenched my fist even harder, my nails painfully digging into the palm of my hands, and one thing became abundantly clear to me: my progenitor's death came far too swiftly and easily. He deserved to suffer for months on end. He should have died begging for his death. Nodding, the brown-haired boy returned to his stance and once more landed a devastating hit on Naruto's stomach that lifted him from the ground. Despite that, the ANBU continued to observe and didn't see fit to act at seeing his charge being pummeled. I, however, had seen more than enough, kicking up a thumbnail-sized stone at my feet straight up into the air. Waiting for the stone's descent, I kicked it again shortly before it could touch the ground, propelling it at Naruto's attackers. A dull sound resounded as the stone hit the moss-haired boy facing away from me in the back of his head. The force of the hit made him stumble forward, releasing the grip on Naruto's arm at the exact same time the brown-haired boy swung his fist for the fourth time. The sudden absence of a hand pulling Naruto right made him move left. Taking full advantage of this momentum and putting everything into his strike, Naruto smashed the big-boned boy's face. The boy's nose broke with a loud crunch. Dazed, he stumbled backward and fell over his own feet. At the exact same time, the brown-haired kid's fist made contact with the wall at the very spot Naruto's head had been just a moment earlier. A painful yelp escaped him as he withdrew his hand and cradled it against his body. Naruto didn't waste any time and took advantage of the opening I had created and viciously attacked the sole remaining and still standing opponent. The ANBU operative's gaze, perched on the roof, fell on me. Falling right into my trap, the moment our eyes met, I put him into a genjutsu rooting him in place. An instant later, my attention returned back to Naruto. His form was off as if he had never received formal training in the academy. His wide swings were something you would expect to see in a brawl between civilians, not a fight between academy students. Despite this apparent lack of skill, his punches were undoubtedly powerful, judging by the reaction whenever his fists made contact with his opponent's body. The brown-haired boy's one-handed attempts at protecting himself were awfully inadequate. Naruto's attacks were about to overwhelm his opponent any moment now. Unfortunately, it was time he didn't have, as the green-haired boy with the broken nose was moments away from rejoining the fight. Sayuri, go help Naruto, I ordered, in an attempt to even the odds. Crossing her arms in front of her chest, she hissed, helping that idiot, definitely not. I couldn't help but notice that this was twice now she had insulted Kushina's son, 2 times too many, and I would make her regret it. Sayuri's refusal wasted precious seconds, seconds that would have allowed her to arrive just in the nick of time to intercept Naruto's second adversary before he could rescue his brown-haired friend from the brink of defeat. A yell was all the warning Naruto got before the green-haired boy rejoined the fight by delivering a kidney shot from the side. The powerful punch made Naruto stumble against the wall, aborting his flurry of attacks. The newly opened up distance created a short lull in the fight that Naruto tried to use to recover, but he wasn't the only one taking a breather. The green-haired boy used the time to wipe the blood from his face that continued to run down his crooked nose. His brown-haired friend, worse for wear, raised himself up from his defensive shell to his full height. Touching his busted lip, he gave Naruto a hateful glare. What I found most curious was the labored breathing the brown-haired kid tried to get back under control, whereas Naruto's breathing was hardly accelerated even though he had exerted himself to a far greater degree. It was a testament to the famed endless Uzumaki stamina. With a nod shared between the two kids, they once more advanced on Naruto, trying to flank him. Naruto, who had leaned against the wall, pushed himself upright and put up his guard for round 2. In the meantime, I was torn between stopping the fight and allowing it to play out a bit further now that Naruto was in a position to defend himself against his attackers. At the end of the day, a fight like this with no rules was a rare chance to get an accurate measure of his character. I needed to see what he was made of before irrevocably tying my fate to his. So far, it seemed he had gotten more from his mother than just his stamina. Minato, by this point, would have made a run for it, either realizing the danger of facing multiple opponents at the same time posed, or getting them to split up and ambush them separately. Kushina, on the other hand, would have been too stubborn to employ such tactics and would have stayed and slugged it out to the last one standing, just like her son. Staying my hand for the moment, I watched the fight proceed. His opponents shuffled closer and closer in an attempt to make use of their greater reach. They tried to keep Naruto at bay while they hammered him from two opposite sides, realizing he could only effectively defend against one of them at a time. Naruto was having none of it. Instead of allowing himself to be cornered, with his back literally against the wall, he went on the offensive. I couldn't tell if he instinctively sought his fortune by attacking, or if analyzing the facts and concluding it was the most promising tactic to apply. Either way, it was the right choice to make. Take out one of your opponents as fast as possible before he can receive help or a breakthrough to end the encirclement, at least momentarily. The problem was both of his opponents had superior range, were bigger and had around 40 pounds more mass than Naruto. Unlike last time, they were alert, no longer underestimating him, and it showed. Naruto made a good attempt when he suddenly struck. Arms raised, shielding his head, he closed the distance to the brown-haired boy, and even though he anticipated a punch coming his way and was fully prepared to block it, he didn't account for the power behind it. The straight aimed at his head, although not penetrating his guard, slowed down his advance, if just barely. This resulted in him ending up a few inches short of where he would have been if not for that hit. A few inches in a fight can make all the difference, as Naruto learned the hard way when his right hook swished past his opponent's chin straight through the hole in the brown-haired boy's guard that opened up when he had thrown the straight. A slight miscalculation of distance, or depending on one's perspective, a miscalculation of timing now that he missed, made the fight far harder. Another straight from his backtracking opponent that ended in Naruto's guard stalled his advance again, long enough for the green-haired kid to move behind him. I wasn't sure what tipped Naruto off, instinct or perhaps the green-haired boy's wheezing, but he managed to evade the punch aimed at the back of his head, ducking beneath it, and nearly ramming his nose into the raised knee of the opponent in front of him. Only his fast reaction, catching the knee with both hands, let him escape the same fate as the green-haired boy and prevented him from getting his nose crushed. Unfortunately, with his hands occupied, the middle kick from the green-haired kid hit home. Naruto was struck an inch above his hip and stumbled backward, in the direction of the big-boned kid my stone throw had taken out. The two standing opponents drew closer from the front, trying to herd him closer to their downed friend. I didn't think he would be in any condition to render them any help for a bit longer, since he was still dazed, lying on the floor and arms raised protectively over his head, nursing his injury. Neither did I think it was what they had planned. It was more likely they hoped to get Naruto to trip over their friend to give them a chance to pin him on the ground, which, if successful, would end the fight decisively in their favor. Naruto, given his far smaller stature, would have no chance to escape their grasp. They relentlessly attacked Naruto, who tried to minimize the damage he suffered by putting up his arms and curling in upon himself, thereby reducing the surface area that could be struck. Meanwhile, he was waiting, looking for the opportunity to launch a counterattack. An opportunity he realized, after one punch after the other battered his defense, with some even penetrating it, wouldn't arise if he didn't create it himself. His opponents, longer reach, double the number of limbs, and doing their best at covering each other's mistakes sufficed at keeping him at bay. He chose to do it in a way that would have made his mother proud and embarrassed in equal measure. Proud because I knew for a fact she had done the same at least once, leaving no doubt that Naruto was definitely her son. Embarrassed because it was a stupid thing to do. No one in their right mind would forego defense and decide to trade blow for blow. Still, that was what he chose to do. Without any regard for his health, he was giving as good as he got as the three of them were beating each other bloody. A punch followed by a punch, a kick by a kick, with the occasional counter mixed in. It made predicting who would win a thing of impossibility. The outcome would be determined by who could take more punishment, something I usually would never dare bet against an Uzumaki and certainly not against Kushina's son On, but it might just as well come down to who landed the lucky punch. Given that Naruto was fighting against two, the odds were not in his favor. Additionally, I had no intention of allowing for the off chance his spirit could end up broken by losing a meaningless fight in a side street. I was about to step in and put an end to the fight when there was a sudden shift. Naruto, who until mere moments ago had been severely struggling, with his defense entirely consisting of the occasional block, and out of nowhere, added parries to it. This allowed him the masterful deflection of even their fastest attacks. It took him only a few more exchanges, and he started to slip around their attacks. He was reading them like an open book. After a short adjustment period, not lasting more than a few heartbeats, he was entirely evading any hit, leaving him to dish out the hurt. His wide and flailing swings from before in just a few exchanges gained a precision I would not have think him capable of for a few years yet. He was accurately, and with perfect timing, striking whenever there was an opening to exploit. By now, he was taking them apart, the slugfest having turned into a one-sided slaughter. It nearly seemed as if, but that couldn't be, if only he wasn't fighting with his back to me so I could make sure. I was about to dismiss the thought as nothing more than mad ravings when he slipped under a punch, and by so doing, had to turn his head slightly when I caught a glance of something that should be outright impossible. How could he have a Sharingan, the ritual? It all suddenly occurred to me. Kushina's blasted adoption ritual had worked. Her hair-brained idea of creating artificial Uzumaki by transferring genetic markers I helped her develop had actually worked. I had been convinced after we had tried to become real blood sisters and nearly died in the process that it had been a failure. Clearly, I had been mistaken. The boost in chakra capacity and the increased density I gained in the aftermath were decidedly not the results of my training efforts as I had initially believed, and Kushina had never mentioned anything because shortly after our folly, she had discovered she was with child. Suddenly it all made perfect sense. We used that ritual in April, and Naruto was born on October the 10th. By then, she must have already been pregnant. That was just like her. Only the scatterbrained Kushina could lose track of her cycle like that. Then the realization hit me. This meant nothing else than that Naruto wasn't just Minato and Kushina's child, he was mine as much as he was theirs. He was mine too, I couldn't help but grin. Convinced of Naruto's impending victory, my focus wavered, and I allowed myself to get distracted by my thoughts. As a result of that momentarily slip, I only registered the steps behind me as they came to a sudden stop. What the was as far as the shrill voice of a rotund woman managed to get when my eyes landed on her. She stilled instantly as I put her in a genjutsu and made her walk into the mouth of the alley to avoid attracting undue attention. When I turned back to the fight, I saw the tail end of how the big-boned kid smashed a brick from behind against the side of Naruto's head. A single moment of inattention threatened to destroy everything I thought I had just found. Despair clenched my heart. My eyes recorded every gruesome detail of how Naruto's eye socket was smashed in, with blood and chunks of his eye getting splattered onto the floor. Another memory, ripe to be added to my collection of the ever-increasing number of my failings, that would undoubtedly haunt me for the rest of my life. A punishment fitting the crime of allowing Naruto to be injured. I pushed myself to go faster, faster than I ever moved, to reach Naruto, fully aware that despite all my powers, it just wasn't enough. I was once again too late to protect what was most dear to me. And the Sharingan, my clan's lauded bloodline, once more proved to be a curse, ensuring I could never forget another one of my failings. Naruto crumbled into a heap on the floor, unconscious. An instant later, I came to a stop beside the boy, catching the wrist of his hand mid-swing in an iron grip, stopping his motion cold. Looking him up and down, I didn't think I had ever felt so much hatred for a person as I did for him at that very moment, as not even my progenitor registered. It would be so easy to snuff the life out of these insects for having dared to raise their hands to my Naruto. In the last moment, my calculating mind prevailed over my raging feelings, and I only ended up kicking the kid's feet from under him while holding onto his hand. His shoulder dislocated, accompanied by a sickening crunch, and he landed painfully on his side. A glance in my eyes kept him from crying out in pain. I wouldn't want his screams to alert anyone. Naruto had two other adversaries attacking him from the front, which I had put under a paralyzing genjutsu on my approach, keeping them in place. I might have need of them, especially should I decide that further punishment was in order. This time I wouldn't allow my prey to escape me into the clutches of death, not before they made amends. I didn't waste another second on that human trash. Kneeling down next to Naruto, I carefully turned him onto his back and lowered his head to the floor, clinging to the hope that up close, the damage to his eye would be far less severe than it seemed. That hope evaporated into thin air when I finally saw his face. His eye socket was a bloody ruin, his eye destroyed beyond repair. Only a few tiny bits and pieces of it remained after it had popped. Desperate, and unwilling to accept this, I used the mystical palm technique trying to fix it, even though I knew it was futile. Jutsu in hand, in the middle of bringing it closer to his face, I halted mid-motion, unable to believe my eyes as right in front of me, his injuries began to rapidly heal. The chunks of flesh connecting to each other grew in size, and within moments his eye regenerated as if it had never been damaged. Wiping the blood from his face, I couldn't help but notice, seeing him up close for the first time, how much he looked like a perfect blend of Kushina and Minato. He had his father's yellow blonde hair combined with Kushina's round chin and cheekbones, and now it seemed he had my eyes. The raw power they had emitted was unlike anything I had ever felt before. To confirm my suspicion, I used a diagnostic jutsu and found myself surprised at how much even I had underestimated the density and sheer amount of chakra at his disposal. He easily outclassed anyone in the village, and the gulf would only grow wider as he grew older. In addition, I couldn't find a single scar or other lasting damage on his body, even though he was malnourished and seemed to lack some vitamins and minerals. I couldn't even imagine how powerful a shinobi he could become with the right tutelage. He was perfect. Our perfect little boy, Kushina and Minato, I thought to myself, with my lips curled upwards as I caressed his cheek. From now on, I would make it my life's mission to protect and care for him, as it always should have been. The beginnings of a plan formed in my mind. Sayuri's careful approach, eyeing the downed kids, reminded me that we weren't alone. My gaze flickered to the big-boned kid on the floor. It would have been easy to assign full responsibility for why my Naruto got hurt to him, but that would just be lying to myself when, in truth, I was to blame. It was my presumption that the big-boned kid lying on the floor was incapacitated which had led to this. He must have shaken off his daze when I wasn't looking, and, upon realizing there was still a fight going on, must have reached for the first thing in the immediate vicinity and found a loose brick. He then must have risen from the ground, and, before he was fully upright, must have been swinging the brick in his hand in a smooth motion with all his might toward Naruto's head. This had forced me to watch in slow motion as the brick shattered against his skull right before my eyes, making me regret the decision of letting that fight play out. I should have interfered right from the very moment they had dared to lay their hands on my Naruto. He might not have liked getting rescued. After all, Kushina certainly never had, with one exception, when Minato did the rescuing, but at least he would have been safe, and none of this would have ever happened. Kushina would have scoffed at me, "Don't sweat it, Mickey. There was no lasting harm done, and you can't always protect him. What you can do is teach him to do it himself." For all the goofing around, she was prone to, she had a habit of voicing profound wisdom out of nowhere. Oh, how I missed that crazy redhead. She would have been right. This insect wasn't worth my time. I returned my attention to my Naruto. Making sure to numb his pain receptors, I took out a scroll and retrieved an alcohol-filled cylindrical bottle from within, and removed the cap. Stroking through his hair, I steeled my nerves for what I was about to do. No matter how much I would rather not hurt my baby, even if I knew it was only temporary, it had to be done. I needed to know, for his sake. Carefully lifting up the eyelids of his left eye with one hand, I worked my thumb, index and middle fingers slowly under the eyelids until I could grab his eye. A small yank later removed it from its socket, and with a chakra scalpel, I severed the optical nerve. I waited, holding the eyeball in my hand until I saw him regenerate the eye I just took, and only then placed it in the bottle and proceeded to take his other one. A retching sound reminded me that I wasn't alone. A glance over my shoulder showed me how my daughter desperately tried to keep her breakfast down. Since I couldn't allow her to contaminate this site, I put her under a quick genjutsu, which had the added bonus that it also prevented her from voicing any questions. Not that it would make a difference even were I to answer them, since I fully intend to be the only one who remembered this incident had ever occurred. Closing the lid on the bottle, I sealed it back into the scroll. Cradling Naruto in my arms, I stood up and carefully positioned him against the wall. He would wake up any minute now. Concentrating more chakra into my eyes activated their advanced form. Seeking out the gaze of all 5 other people present one after the other, I went to work and modified their memories, or in Sayuri's case erased the knowledge of ever being here. Except for Sayuri, they would remember Naruto kicking the 3 kids' asses, and since I made sure he would be the first to wake, they wouldn't doubt it. Waking, lying in their own blood with their prey-turned-predator nowhere in sight, I made sure the woman, who turned out to be the big-boned kid's mother, the family relation undeniable, wouldn't take too kindly to her child beating on someone younger, a mild lingering suggestion that the Hokage wouldn't like it if someone hurt the QB brat doing the trick. The ANBU was the only one for which I took my sweet time sifting through his memories. They were a treasure trove of information, although most of it was not really useful to me other than learning that ANBU were used with increasing frequency to watch the Uchiha compound and to shadow its members when outside. The only conclusion to be drawn from this was that we were under surveillance. Since I doubted he would risk alienating a founding clan over rumors, he must have had some credible intel to motivate this course of action. I suspected someone inside the clan was willingly or unwillingly feeding the village information. Pondering that for a moment made my oldest offspring and my little brother the most likely candidates. They were amongst the small number with the necessary skill, had ties outside the clan, and given they both were ANBU enjoyed the trust of our village leader. I had known Fugaku would be an obstacle to my plans, but I had assumed for entirely different reasons, and this certainly complicated things. If I wanted to preserve the clan as a tool, dedicating it to one goal and one goal only, safeguarding Naruto, then taking drastic measures was inevitable. The infestation that had brought the clan low need to be cut out, root and stem, to allow for a new beginning. Only this time, I would personally make sure it was done properly. Sayuri, come here. It is time to go home, I informed her, putting out my hand for her to grab it. There are some important errands I have to run. Lying in my bed under my covers feigning sleep, I listened closely to every sound in my surroundings. I could hear Fugaku snoring from his room at the end of the hallway, the friction of Sayuri's blanket brought about by the lifting and lowering of her chest, and absolute silence from Azumi's room. A casual look into her memories during supper disclosed that she was out guarding my Naruto tonight. She would have been the only person in the house I would have had to take extra precautions not to wake. Unlike Fugaku, she was taking missions outside the village. Her senses and instincts had been honed by regular brushes with death. Outside the house was a different matter. From the memories of my Naruto's ANBU detail, I knew they were watching our clan compound. It had been rumored among those of us who regularly wandered into the village proper that the number of ANBU operatives around our compound had seen a notable uptick in recent months, a rumor I knew to be true since my run-in yesterday. This was odd for a variety of reasons, the most important being that they weren't supposed to be policing the inside of the village. Their stated purpose was to guard vital infrastructure, the Hokage, and the village against outside threats. Since they had apparently been tasked with watching us, it indicated that the village leadership no longer trusted us. This fact, at least according to Fugaku's memories, was responsible for swaying most of the undecided and reluctant to see things his and my progenitor's way. It was getting harder to deny the reality that the noose around our necks was getting tighter every day, and that this was no longer about someone's pride being hurt, or the villagers not showing the clan the respect and deference it was due according to them, but about survival. At this point, helped along by the village's actions, their coup was the inevitable consequence. For all I cared, they could go and kill one another until there was no one left. Regrettably, however, the clan still had some uses for my Naruto and me. And in order to submit them to their rightful purpose, I needed a few things from the Uzumaki compound. Since I couldn't afford to be seen going anywhere near it, I had to make certain my absence wouldn't be noticed. To that effect, the ability I had gained from Obito's Mangekyo Sharingan proved to be useful. Unlike Minato's Hiraishin no Jutsu, which connects the ceiling array on his body to one of his markers like a door he can step through, Kamui puts a room between those 2 points. This comes with its own sets of advantages and disadvantages. One of the foremost advantages is that it allows the user, once inside the room, to open a door virtually anywhere. It suffices to imagine where you want to go for a door to appear, which is another advantage of the jutsu. Just because there is a door doesn't mean you have to cross the threshold. On the contrary, once a door is summoned, it can be used to look upon the other side. Admittedly, the view is distorted and colorless, and no sound goes through. Unless you move your eyes past the threshold, which will make them visible on the other side. It's quite different from how Minato described pinging one of his tags, a short burst presenting him with a snapshot of the immediate vicinity of his tag's location as his detection jutsu washes over the surrounding area. This, given enough tags, gave him complete awareness of what was going on a battlefield, not limited to just one point of view that was slow in altering its angle and relative position. Thus, Kamui certainly wasn't the best spying or battlefield awareness jutsu imaginable, but it served my momentary needs rather well. It allowed the repeated creation of doors high up in the air around the Uchiha compound to search for hidden ANBU operatives. The bird's eye view combined with the superior eyesight of the Sharingan allowed me to identify their hiding spots nearly effortlessly. With chakra sensors that were worth anything being rarer than a drop of water in the desert, and the occasional sensor the Yamanaka clan produced hardly deserving the name, I only had to make certain that no Hyuga was amongst those watching us, since I doubted one of them would miss my sudden disappearance. The animal mask and cloak most solely relied upon to hide their identity made identifying the ANBU clan affiliations difficult, but it was not impossible if one knew what to look for. In the case of the Hyuga, they had a particular lithe build, essentially no calluses from holding kunai or other weapons on their hands, and they rarely, if ever, turned their heads. While one of those factors alone was insufficient to tell, finding all three made it a near certainty that it was a Hyuga. Fortunately for me, there didn't seem to be one among them. It was no great surprise the number of Hyuga who found themselves in ANBU was relatively low. Not because of lack of skill on the Hyuga part. Dragon would have given his right arm and leg for a mere dozen of them. Their ability to gather intelligence was unmatched, but the caged bird seal made branch members liabilities since they come equipped with torture and deadman switches not under the control of the village. As a precaution, I also looked outside the Uzumaki compound. All it would take would be a single ANBU seeing me appear out of nowhere to ruin it all. It was presumptuous to assume that the residents of the former Hokage wouldn't be watched, despite it being protected by seals Uzushio would have been envious of. According to Kushina, Uzushio's downfall hadn't gone by Mito without leaving marks. She used the last years of her life to turn the already formidable protected Uzumaki compound into a venerable fortress. Kushina, on more than one occasion, jokingly said other Obaa sans would take up knitting in their old age to pass the time, while hers devised new ways to dismember and kill any uninvited visitors. If only half the things I was privy to were accurate, I didn't doubt for a single moment that Obito would have had a few very bad last few seconds had he dared to attack Kushina within her home. Still, thinking about this made me furious, because if not for those precautions the first thought up, she wouldn't have had to give birth inside a cave to protect his precious village, and Kushina would still be alive. The assumption alone, that no one in the decades since it was built would have stumbled over that secret cave just a few leagues away from the village and deduced its purpose, was outright presumptuous, but the illusion had to be maintained, which was the reason the few ANBU who accompanied them couldn't have been from a clan. God forbid someone with actual skill being part of the team guarding the sitting Hokage, his wife, and their soon-to-be infant child. If not for Hiruzen losing his wife in the attack, a woman I was convinced he had loved, I would have made sure he wouldn't have lived a day past the attack, since one could argue he was one of the few who profited from their demise. Still, no matter how hard I tried, I could never shake the suspicion that there was more at play here than even Obito's part suggested. With him dead at Minato's hands, I wasn't sure I would ever get the answers I was looking for. While my thoughts had run rampant, I had finished scouting the compound looking through the tiers in reality. Watching it from a dozen elevated positions confirmed that no one was anywhere near it, let alone watching it. My caution momentarily satisfied, I vanished beneath my blankets and reappeared inside my Kamui dimension. Reaching beneath my nightgown, I retrieved a ceiling scroll. I changed into the outfit the scroll contained, consisting of a black unmarked mask, some simple black pants, a black shirt, and a black hooded cloak. The white silk kimono I wore to sleep was hardly suitable for a night raid. Steeling myself, I reappeared in front of the main gate of the Uzumaki compound. This was it, the moment of truth. I would either get my hands on everything needed to put my plan into action, or it would all go up in flames, and with it, the best chance to provide a better life for my Naruto. Taking one last deep breath, I placed my hand on the Uzumaki swirl adorning the stone gate. It was time to find out whether Jiraiya had messed with the seals and locked me out. He was the only other living person I knew of with access to the control seal. When the gate wings parted before me, splitting the swirl in half, I released the breath I hadn't known I was holding. My anxiety only fully left me when I made the first step past the gate, and nothing happened. I followed the narrow paved stone path, leading through a small forest encircling the entire compound. It wasn't an easy path to follow, and I don't mean the overgrowth from years without anyone taking care of the plants growing alongside it, nor that I was occasionally forced to cut my way through plant obstructions. The reason it was hard was the memories I was plagued by. Wave after wave rained down on my mind with every step I took. I had walked down this path countless times, whether it was with Kushina, Minato, or both by my side, talking, joking, or just teasing one another, and sometimes, when I was visiting them, I walked it alone. Never once had it seemed so lonely, nor had my heart constricted in such sorrow that only grew worse the closer I got to their home the way it did now. Halfway there, it hurt worse than when I had watched them die. Deep down, a part of me must have been unable to accept the reality and still held on to the hope they were alive and well, living happily with Naruto right behind the next hill. Somehow we had just drifted apart, and one day in the future, we would just run into one another, and everything would go back to how it was. The only thing keeping that illusion alive was the uncertainty of what awaited me in their home. My body was fighting me every step of the way, not allowing my conscious mind to shatter what my unconscious mind desperately clung onto. I stopped, hand placed on the trunk of a tree for support as I was warring with myself. My breathing was fast and shallow, and my emotional pain suddenly turned physical. Clenching desperately trying to get my accelerated heart rate under control, I slumped against the tree. Looking up at the star-spangled night sky, I finally realized that something wasn't right. It was as if a powerful compulsion prevented me from taking another step in the direction of their home. My eyes advanced to their eternal Mangekyu state and shattered the last vestiges of my progenitor's genjutsu using his eye ability. My heart rate began to normalize immediately, and the world felt as if a haze I hadn't noticed was even there had been cast aside. Koto Amatsukami, it had to be. My progenitor must have planted another suggestion deep within me, not connected to all the other commands he had given me, That's why it hadn't already broken and only weakened when I had gotten rid of the others. This one forced me to stay away from the Uzumaki compound, the only place he wouldn't have been able to reach me. It became clear, even though I hadn't been allowed near Naruto, why, in all those years, I had never sought solace in their home, why I had never visited to wallow in reminiscences, and why I had never bothered to come here to take a keepsake to remember them by. Insidious is the only term fitting to describe Koto Amatsukami. Allowing the mind of the affected to justify their actions deserves nothing less. However, now I knew what I was looking for. Sifting through own memories, I began to question every decision I had ever made, looking for anything I had done that seemed out of place. It was only when I was completely convinced that this time it really had been the last genjutsu compelling me and that I had fully regained my free will did I stand up and resumed my travel. Emerging from the forest, I came to a stop on the small hill overlooking the enormous building complex in the middle of the clearing. It was a sobering sight to see the once beautiful and well cared for garden from my memories covered in weeds. Their growth had gotten rampant with no one here to rein it in, choking the life out of crops, herbs, and flowers. It wouldn't stay that way for long if I had anything to say about it. At a measured step, I cleared a path through the greenery right up to the front porch of the main building. Placing my hand on the handle was all it took for the door to swing open. Compared to the garden, the inside of the house was the complete opposite, spotless and clean. My first stop was the master seal in the basement. I had been in this remote part of the house only once before. During Kushina's pregnancy, shortly after she asked me to become Naruto's godmother, she had led me through this part of the house until we ended up in front of a heavily reinforced door. She, with a sheepish smile, had reached above the doorframe, and her hand had come back with a key. She had then proceeded to use the key to open the door. Standing before the very same door, I, too, reached above the doorframe and swept for the key I hoped was still there, since getting access to what was behind that door was instrumental to my plans. When my fingers curled around what I was looking for, it took a load off my mind. The key was warm to my touch, a step below being unpleasant, and vibrated in my hand, making its displeasure at being wielded by a non-Uzumaki known. It felt like only yesterday that Kushina had had a stern talk with it, explaining in great detail the concept of a godmother before the key allowed me to so much as touch it. It helped to put into perspective why the whole world considered all Uzumaki to be nuts. Talking to a key, you couldn't make that up. As I placed my hand on the wall, the lights adorning it flared to life, illuminating the spiraling staircase leading deeper into the basement, leading into a small antechamber containing only a single monstrous door on the opposite side of the stairs. Time had done nothing to lessen the impression I got from the door since the first and only time I had visited. The intricate seal carvings adorning it still gave me that ominous feeling that a single wrong step could be my last. Looking down at the key in my hands, I couldn't help myself and addressed it. I'm aware you don't like me, but I need to get into the vault. It's important to protect Naruto, Kushina-chan's son. I couldn't be sure if it would do me any good in dissuading the key from having me killed, but it at least calmed my nerves. I got my answer when the key's temperature sank. Not wasting any more time, I put the key into the door and with bated breath, waited for the heavy double doors to swing open and give way to the extensive library full of scrolls hidden behind them. Although not nearly as extensive as the Uchiha library full of jutsu we stole with a glance since the conception of our clan, it was still an impressive collection of knowledge encompassing every field of jutsu imaginable, the sole exception being the Fuinjutsu section. I doubted there existed a more comprehensive collection in all of the elemental nations short of the lost Uzumaki library on Uzushio. Fuinjutsu was a shinobi art that wasn't really practiced inside the Uchiha clan since it was the one art in which our eyes didn't grant us a noteworthy advantage over others. While it was helpful to be able to commit a once-seen unencrypted seal memory with perfect clarity, it did little to help one's understanding of it. It only allowed us to recreate an assortment of specific tools, akin to a blacksmith who could only make standard kunai unable to do anything else, even just changing the blade length or the handle being far outside our capabilities unless we put in the same hard work to study and practice any non-Uchiha would have to. That was what distinguished a true master of this art from the rest, the ability to create seals tailor-made to any given situation, an arduous and long path, most haven't had the patience to follow. This was especially true for members of my clan since there were numerous far easier paths, helped by their eyes, open to them. A path I, regretfully, had barely set foot on, despite both Kushina and Minato having walked it. Nevertheless, it was still a treasure trove of knowledge, albeit not the reason for today's visit. I would have to spend more time here in the near future than I would prefer when it came time for me to enter and catalog the Uchiha library I intended to take with me into it. Without pausing, I removed the key and attached it to the delicate metal necklace around my neck as I stepped through the door leading to the master seal. It was one of 4 doors, the other 3 leading to an armory, a forge, and a training room, respectively. It was a bland room beside some carvings on the walls, ceiling, and floor, all leading into a hip-high pedestal in the middle of the room. Hovering a few inches above the pedestal was a whitish-blue glowing orb roughly 1 foot in diameter. I placed my hands on the orb, just as Kushina had shown me. Immediately, the glow of the orb intensified, and the inside began to change. The chaotic milky swirling pattern slowed down, and the white hue separated into an assortment of different colors. At first, they took the shape of letters, then words that combined into whole sentences. With a mere thought, I selected the guest book and had a look at the last visitors and the dates of their visit. To my great relief, no one had seen fit to enter the compound after the QB attack, so I didn't have to fear any surprises, nor having to track down something that had been stolen. After another thought, I found myself staring at the compound's access list. My name was listed under administrator, which I had assumed would be the case. The death of Kushina and Minato had promoted my prior status, and just as I suspected, I wasn't the only one whose status had been bumped. Jiraiya's name was right next to mine. With what I had planned, the last thing I wanted to deal with was him having access to this house. Nothing good would come of his meddling, not that he had any right to, after abandoning my Naruto. Without hesitating for a second, I stripped him, the only living person beside me who was allowed to enter the premises without prior permission, of all rights. I was about to remove my hands, having achieved what I came here for when I noticed that the sealing array was months away from failing because it was running low on chakra. It had never crossed my mind that this could happen. I had never used any seals with an effect that had to be constantly maintained, like barriers. Since there was a chance that someone attempting to breach the compound could deplete the remaining chakra even faster, I had no other choice. I needed to replenish them as far as possible. Relying on them while they might be compromised would be a grave mistake. Taking a deep breath, I reluctantly started the process. Instantly, there was a heavy drain as my chakra was siphoned away in large gulps. It took the globe a few scant seconds to nearly empty my reserves and leave me panting on my knees. Despite being aware that the device was created with Uzumaki in mind and prepared for the drain, the speed with which it robbed me of my, for anybody not named Uzumaki, large reserves took me completely by surprise. Not being a censor, getting such a reminder of how vastly more chakra they had on average truly drove the point of why the Uzumaki were this highly regarded more than Kushina just shrugging off our training sessions ever could have. Thinking on it, the only times I had seen her show signs of exhaustion were when she had spammed high-level ninjutsu like a woman possessed during our spars. This only hardened my resolve. I took a few moments to recuperate before I tried to get back up. After a few unsure steps, I left the basement the same way I had entered it. I returned to the lobby of the main house, and, for a moment, just stood there staring up the stairs. It was one of the 2 large elaborate staircases hugging the right and left corners of the room, each spiraling upwards around a potted bonsai standing 10 feet tall in the center of each. It was the right side my eyes were focused on. I dreaded what I would find up there, the confirmation they were truly gone. Unfortunately, there was no escaping it. I needed to do this for my Naruto's sake. With a deep sigh, I began to move once more. As I was ascending the stairs, my fingers were caressing the wide railing Kushina and I had misused countless times as a slide when we were children. I couldn't recall a single instance of us walking down the stairs as normal human beings, not as apes, the words Mito Obasan used to chastise us with a grin plastered on her face whenever she caught us doing it. This was it, the final step, one more, and I would be on the second floor proper. From there, it was 20 more steps to Kushina's room, the first door to the right. I shook off the trepidation threatening to draw me into its grasp once more and at a hastened pace, closed the distance. I allowed myself one last deep breath with my hands around the handle before I pushed it down. The door opened seamlessly, and I couldn't stop a smile from forming on my lips, as I saw the metaphorical battlefield before me. Scrolls in various stages of being opened were not only strewn around on the large table and took up most of the right wall, but also littered the floor. In some cases, the scrolls were piled into heaps, the occasional clothing article mixed between them. It was like a look into the past. The seals placed throughout the house that prevented dust from settling made the room look like she was still living here and had just stepped out for a minute. Taking a few steps into the room, careful not to step on anything, I could only shake my head. It was a wonder Kushina could work at all in this chaos, let alone find anything. She was the exact opposite of Minato, being chaos personified while he possessed a near-compulsive need to create order. Sorting and labeling things was seemingly one of his hobbies. It was no wonder they had separate studies, they wouldn't have lasted a week without killing each other. Apparently, opposites do seem to attract, as they say. Now it was only a matter of finding what I was looking for. I had originally assumed a few hours would provide me with plenty of time to achieve all my goals in coming here. As my eyes roamed the room, I began to doubt that assessment. Well, there was no helping it, and with that thought in mind, I went to work. I started in the corner. I remembered Kushina hurling things at me whenever her frustration got the better of her. The scroll containing the seal intended to safeguard the Sharingan was no exception when I had told her about my progenitor's decision to refuse to use the seal, rendering all her hard work in coming up with it in the first place for naught as a result. Offering to pay her out of my own pocket for the time she had invested had done nothing to improve her mood. On the contrary, it had caused the opposite effect, and instead of placating her as intended, I had drawn her ire. It was one of the few truly heated arguments we'd had with each other. As Kushina had been affronted, I would think she would take money in exchange for a favor rendered to a friend. That was by that point one of the increasingly rarer instances in which she had proven her nickname had been a well-deserved one. Age, or the relationship with Minato, had surely been responsible for mellowing her out. Then again, when it came to Kushina, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't picture age slowing her down. With what we had nearly ended up doing while in the middle of the argument, she had suddenly decided to turn the battle of words into a battle of strength and had tackled me onto her bed. It definitely had to be the with Minato. Nothing else made any sense when it came to her. I could still recall the feeling of her lips on mine, the hunger as she nearly devoured me whole. Fondly basking in that memory, I caught myself as my fingers absent-mindedly traced my lips. Giving in to a sudden urge, I walked over to her bed in the corner of the room and picked up her pillow. Just holding it in my hands allowed me to smell Kushina's scent, still clinging to it after all these years. Bringing it closer to my face, taking a whiff nearly overwhelmed me with all the memories it triggered. I had to fight the temptation to just lie down in her bed, wrap myself in her blanket, close my eyes, and let myself fall. Ignoring the time constraints I was operating under and the reason I was here in the first place, I couldn't bring myself to do it. This might very well be the only place that kept Kushina's fragrance alive, and the thought of denying Naruto the chance to get to know his mother's scent by lying in her bed because of my selfish desires made me feel sick. I placed the pillow back onto the bed and then returned to my work, making sure to not disturb this temple any more than absolutely necessary. I was carefully looking at scrolls for half an hour, and during that time, I came across the craziest ideas and was already reconciling with the fact the seal was no longer here and that I might have to look elsewhere. When I lifted another scroll from the pile and pried it open, I remembered some of the diagrams. This was the scroll. Placing it onto an unoccupied corner of the table, I released a seal. A device about the length of a kunai of cylindrical shape with a handle piece appeared. Kushina had designed it. In essence, a seal stamp, allowing one of two possible registered users to apply what she called a micro seal directly to someone's eyeball. Once the seal was applied, should the eye leave the eye socket or the person the eye belonged to died, the seal would activate and destroy the eye. I picked the device up and moved the slider forward, and a small needle emerged from within the object. All it would take to apply the seal to someone's eye would be pressing it against someone's eyeballs and pushing a little chakra into the handle. Creating a seal no bigger than a dot, it was so small it was barely visible. Moreover, if placed on the eye while the pupil was looking upwards and pulling the eyelid aside, it could be completely hidden, making a distinction between an eyeball with the seal and one without impossible short of a close-up inspection. No one else would ever know it was even there to begin with, meaning that, unlike the Hyuga cursed seal broadcasting for the whole world to see that stealing their eyes was for naught, I had to tell people of its existence to dissuade them from even trying. This was half the reason for such seals to exist in the first place. It wouldn't do my clansmen any good if their eyes were destroyed after they were stolen, even though the faces the thieves would have made realizing they had been outsmarted might be worth it. Since this wasn't the only way for someone to get their hands on the Sharingan, I released another two instruments from the scroll. This time they looked more like actual stamps, one for each gender, able to suspend their ability to produce offspring outside the barrier they were keyed to. The original idea was to key it into the detection barrier surrounding Konoha, thereby preventing conception outside of Konoha's walls. This was a measure that would have served the needs of the Uchiha clan just fine. Kushina even had enough foresight to realize that keying such a seal into a stationary barrier could become an issue, and therefore she had included contingencies. After all, something as simple as a major overhaul of the detection barrier, or it stopped working properly, a far too likely prospect without an Uzumaki present to maintain it, or some other reason why the Uchiha would no longer live inside it would essentially render everyone with the seal effectively sterile. The instruments themselves could be keyed to selected users, those being the only ones able to apply and remove these seals. The original idea was to link them to the clan head, and the heir or heiress. They were designed in such a fashion that other users could be added only with the consent of one of the keyed-in users. As a precaution, there could only be two registered users of these tools at any given time, and keying in a new user also removed the previous user not assisting in the process from being able to use the tool. The seals themselves, Kushina swore it, were impossible to remove without using these tools. The encryption was unbreakable, randomized, and used the user's chakra to create a different key for every seal applied with the keys being stored within the tools. It was a nice concept, and I could easily substitute the barrier surrounding Konoha with the one surrounding the Uzumaki compound for my needs. Considering the precarious state my plans would put the clan in, keeping the seals keyed to the barrier surrounding Konoha would leave too many avenues of abuse open for my liking, and while using the Uzumaki compound barrier instead would be more secure, it still was far from ideal. So what I was really after was the original seal Kushina had based it on, which she called a relic of patriarchal society. Originally the seal was intended to ensure that no line theft could be committed, which was achieved by preventing any female marked with the seal from becoming pregnant by anyone except the man whose blood was applied to the tool prior to crafting the seal. I knew she had sealed it into the same scroll, the height of what her twisted sense of order would allow her to do. As luck had it, she hadn't rearranged it after she tossed the scroll away, and another cylindrical tool appeared after some twiddling with the scroll. This was it. None of these seals had the additional functions the Hyuga caged bird seal possessed. To be fair, it had never been intended to be used the way it still was to this very day. Kushina, at first, had been very reluctant to even entertain my request to create a seal to safeguard our eyes. It had taken some prodding, but eventually, she had told me why. It was not a commonly known fact, but the caged bird seal had been created by the Uzumaki under false pretenses. Long before Konoha's founding, the Hyuga clan had approached the Uzumaki desiring a seal to keep their criminals in check and to prevent them, in case a prisoner was to escape, from passing on the Byakugan to their enemies. As the Uzumaki realized what the Hyuga had actually used the seal for, to say they weren't happy was an understatement, and this got the Hyuga blacklisted as recipients of Uzumaki seals. From what I had gathered, they had even considered cutting all ties to that particular seal, including waiving the fee the Hyuga had to pay. Seals are expensive. Customized reusable seals, in particular, were more so, but ultimately decided against doing it, not wanting to reward them for this. So the Uzumaki clan, to this day, grudgingly accepted the money just so the Hyuga couldn't hold onto it. Who would blame Kushina? Not wanting to go into the annals of history as the one responsible for another such folly was quite the understandable sentiment. Not that I would have ever considered such a seal. To inflict pain as a means of control was such a crude and barbaric method and completely unnecessary. All it did was foster resentment in the recipients, and considering that the caged bird seal wasn't foolproof, it was a spectacularly idiotic idea. No, I would have to rely on different tools to ensure the fealty of my clan. I didn't particularly like the prospect, but I wasn't in a position to be picky about my methods. That was the moment my eyes fell on a half-opened scroll lying on the table. I could only read a small part, but the words, prisoner, and execution, I managed to decipher aroused my curiosity. Giving the contents a once-over, I had a hard time believing my luck, and the urge to kiss Kushina came over me. Even from beyond the grave, she was still giving me ideas. Admittedly, this time it might actually not be such a bad one. Leave it to her to have seals for which most clans would gladly kill casually lying around with no care in the world. To be fair, the compound was virtually impregnable, and I had my suspicions about why the door handles leading into most rooms glowed when touched. Still, seals like this were supposed to be locked up behind the thickest door and defenses one could possibly find. Uzumaki. Time and time again, I was glad they were peace-loving people when they were still around, which hadn't stopped people even back then who considered them to be too scary to be allowed to live. Just looking at what I had lying in front of me, which was just a glimpse of what they were truly capable of if not hindered by moral constraints and aversion to any form of violence, told me that assessment was more than accurate, frighteningly so. It was a good thing the only thing Kumo and Kiri received from Uzushiogakure was the deaths of their troops. The Uzumaki took them all with them when they wiped the island not only of any sign of life, but also of the evidence that there had ever been a civilization settled there. The seal depicted on the scroll in two variants would come in very handy. From what I understood, it was designed as a means to execute people. The creator apparently considered it wasteful to just kill criminals when their lives could be repurposed, which was why he intended to give ending their lives some lasting meaning by giving the community something back, essentially making them atone for their sins with their deaths. In a sense, he succeeded in that with the seal he came up with. Some would even call it poetic justice, because in order to be sentenced to death, you would have to be convicted of a capital crime, which in most cases was murder. So by transferring the life force of the criminal to another person, adding that life force to theirs, he gave back a life, not figuratively, but literally. According to the description, this meant, among other things, that the remaining lifetime of the donor was transferred to the recipients, thus prolonging their lives. Additionally, the life force could be used to heal terminal conditions, even going so far as being able to regenerate lost limbs. The first variant in the scroll was a sacrificial altar array intended to be used for executions. The second, more interesting, variant explained how that seal could be used to link two or more people together. In this form, its intended purpose was for it to be used as a death switch on criminals if, for some reason, they needed to be kept alive while still maintaining the means to kill them should they try to escape. It was noteworthy the sealing matrix was flexible enough that with a few additions, it would allow people connected by it to share a life force with one another, but what I considered more interesting was that the activation of the seal could be tied to preconditions that would trigger the activation of the seal. I already was getting ideas on how to repurpose that seal to fit my needs. With the detailed instructions of the seal, I might just barely be able to craft what I had in mind following the instructions to the letter even though the particulars went way over my head. This admittedly wasn't exactly a good idea. Messing with seals without understanding every aspect of them never was, but the opportunity they presented me with was just too good to pass up, since it was more than just unlikely I would get such a golden opportunity again. Combined with the detection seal I had found earlier, and the scroll full of paralyzing seals Kushina had crafted to sell, I had everything I came here for and more. Although it took some effort not to think overly much about why a seal originally intended for parents who grew tired of searching for their wayward children was among one of Kushina's pile of open scrolls. It allowed people marked with it to sense the general direction of one another by tugging at a metaphorical string connecting them so long as they were alive. Gathering my chakra, I created a single cage bunchen, the extent of what I dared to do after I was drained by the orb, and handed the scrolls over to her. Tasked with preparing for what was about to come, she would remain behind. I reached for the warm key hidden beneath my shirt and activated Kamui. A second later, I emerged unharmed and without incident in the Kamui dimension. I released the breath I hadn't been aware I had been holding, and changed back into my sleep attire before teleporting into my bedroom and slipping beneath my covers. With a smile on my face anticipating what tomorrow held in store, I drifted off to sleep. Just in. Community. Forum. More. Pyrope by Time Parrot 0x. Anime Naruto rated. M. English, Adventure and Hurt Comfort, Naruto U, Sasuke U, Itachi U, Makoto U. Words. 64k plus. Faves. 772. Follows. 937. Published. December 26, 2022. Updated. October 2, 2023. 166 Chapter 03 Tea Time. Disclaimer. I don't own Naruto. Author's note. In case it wasn't glaringly obvious, given the direction of the story. This story will contain major character deaths, including people that usually are exempt from this. This chapter was edited by Praterkson. Chapter 03. Tea Time. Hey, there sis, Shiwui greeted me. So what's this all about? He asked as he plopped down across from me at the Chibudai. In response to the stern look I threw his way, he didn't hesitate to raise his hands in surrender and allayed, not that I'm complaining. But you have to agree it's not every day that you break into my house to leave a note saying to come over for some tea. Raising my eyebrows at his cavalier attitude, which even for him seemed out of place considering recent events, I wondered aloud, you haven't heard? Then again, neither one of us could say we were close to our father. Heard what? Father died yesterday. What? How? He exclaimed, shocked. They say his heart gave out. At least, that was what Fugaku believed the coroner told him, since I burned his body to ashes as the tradition within our clan, after I removed his eyes. Nobody would ever learn the truth of the matter. His heart, he repeated, only to add, mumbling under his breath, I didn't know he had one. Playing my role of the prim and proper wife of the clan leader and loving daughter, I chided my little brother, you should not speak ill of the dead, it is unbecoming. Sorry, he said, cowed as silence settled over us. It took him more than a minute to regain his voice. I hummed my agreement as I filled the cup in front of him with hot tea. I know father and I didn't have a good relationship and that we weren't close. Hell, I'd say we weren't even family. A sentiment we apparently had in common, little brother, I thought. After all, I was just the spare, the second born, who couldn't hope to live up to his expectations. Everything about me, according to him, was just wrong. My personality, the way I walk, the way I talk, you name it. I'm sure father could have found a flaw in it when it pertained to me, he said with a hint of regret in his voice I couldn't empathize with. I never understood how you could get along with him. I'm actually curious. How did you manage him not constantly looking at you as if your mere existence was an insult to him? Years and years of having him adjust and mess with my personality and mind until I became what he envisioned his perfect daughter should be like, I thought as I balled my hand under the table into a fist. Calmly and with a pleasant smile on my lips, I told him, it certainly did not help your case that you made a sport out of trying to get a rise out of father. Yeah, there was that. He made a bad attempt at hiding his embarrassment behind a laugh, and we fell into a comfortable silence sipping tea. Well, when's the funeral? In a week from now, his ashes will be scattered across the Naka River as per his will. I see, he mulled over my words. You know, I never could wrap my head around why your husband ended up taking the mantle of clan leadership and not you. After all, you were father's perfect little princess. The answer to his question was a simple one. Father hadn't considered me a suitable replacement for himself, and instead had made me serve his chosen successor as breeding stock. To suit that role, father had groomed me to become the most agreeable wife possible. That way, father had tried to ensure Fugaku's heir would carry his blood and ideology. Still, those were not truths my brother needed to know. It was my decision. I didn't want to spend most of my time with those stuffy elders and instead wanted to take care of my family. Who could blame you? He said sagely. Where is the rest of the family? The last time I was here, Sayuri wouldn't stop talking and asking questions about what being in ANBU was like. Apparently, her one-chan refuses to talk about it. Fugaku is working, Sayuri is with Kasumi, and as for where Izumi is, you would probably know better than me. You might have a point there, he conceded with a laugh. Speaking of kids, what can you tell me about Sayuri's classmate, Uzumaki Naruto? That question immediately put him on guard. What makes you think I know anything about him? He shot back. Please, do not insult my intelligence. Need I remind you that I was once part of ANBU, too? I also know how the higher-ups think. They would never allow a vulnerable village asset to be without protection. Protection that, as it happens, is not provided by the Uchiha police force, which in turn just leaves us with ANBU. He completed my sentence for me. Let's assume you are correct. That still doesn't mean I know shit. I inclined my head, wordlessly relaying to him the question. Really? This is how you want this to go down? No, it does not if we were talking about anything else than Uzumaki Naruto. As I mentioned earlier, little brother, I wore an animal mask myself. I know how popular those missions within the village are, for obvious reasons, and that for the sake of fairness, there is a rotation in place for all low-risk recurring missions. A mission like guarding the village Jinchuriki certainly enjoys great popularity with your comrades, so let us try this again. What can you tell me about Uzumaki Naruto? Why the sudden interest, one-chan? You didn't once ask me about the kids since I joined ANBU, and I've been with them for, wow, nearly 3 years, time does fly. I recently regained my freedom and am interested in the well-being of my godson, who turned out to be my Kain was on the tip of my tongue. Instead, I said, father's death made me reconsider some of my life choices. It did. He had trouble containing his surprise at my statement. Don't tell me you also are going to divorce Fugaku, he joked. Of course not, I said in fake indignation, he is the father of my children. He deserved so much worse for his part in preventing me from taking custody of my Naruto. If not for him running to my progenitor when I had made my intentions clear to get him to talk some sense into me, Naruto would have grown up calling me his mother. Right, he drawled, you do know that getting rid of him doesn't change that. It would also allow you to depose him. You couldn't be a worse leader if you tried, he added playfully. I saw it for what it was. an obvious attempt to blunt the edge of his prior statement. It was hard not to notice that he seemed awfully interested in a change of leadership. Given his strong dislike for politics, it seemed my suspicions that my little brother was a spy weren't completely unfounded. To be fair, he had a point. In an ideal world, different leadership might be able to avert the village and the clan clashing. Realistically, if I were to take over the clan and make inroads in that direction, the hardliners within the clan would undoubtedly try to kill me. Since this would mean they had to cross the line of going against their own family, they would take care of Shiwui at the same time. I was confident in my skills, but I was also aware that there were countless other ways to be killed besides getting a kunai rammed into your throat. It wouldn't be the first time that motivated shinobi succeeded in bringing someone said to be impossible to beat in a fight down via some exotic means, and the clan, Fugaku most likely leading the charge, would be very motivated. So, no, little brother, that wasn't actually a viable option, not for me. The only one who would profit from that would be the village by pitting the Uchiha against each other in order to prevent them from starting a civil war with the village. It could work at least for a time, and it would allow them to pick up the pieces, or, if they were bold enough to violate the Konoha charter, support one side over the other. I had no interest in becoming the village's patsy or puppet. I had already had enough of that to last me several lifetimes. Nevertheless, he was playing a dangerous game, voicing those thoughts to the wife of the current clan leader. Especially considering his status as a spy. It was reckless, but then again, when wasn't my brother? Although, I doubted he had done that to gauge my loyalties. I know what you're doing, I chastised. Stop trying to change the topic and answer the question. Taking his time scrutinizing me, he eventually dropped his shoulders, eased the tension, and sighed, well, I guess there is no harm in telling you. I don't think you would hurt Kushina's kid, but please keep what I tell you to yourself. The last thing I need, at the moment, is being dragged before Dragon cause I mentioned some irrelevant tidbits of info over tea with my sister. In response, my brother received the best encouraging smile I could manage while internally I was seething. The impertinence of him to even consider me capable of hurting my Naruto. I had half a mind to remove his intestines through his nose for that slight. Where to start, he considered as he thrummed his index finger against the chibudai. He's a good kid. Kind, boisterous, exuberant, and, just like Kushina, has a verbal tick. He's also smart, alarmingly so. Contrary to what the academy instructors write into their report cards about the QB brat. They're the ones sabotaging his education by removing him from class for made-up reasons. Under the chibudai, my fingers painfully dug into my thigh. I've never seen anyone come up with traps on the fly the way he does for those pranks of his. Using only the materials he has at hand, it's frankly mind-boggling. The sophistication of some of them is unbelievable. To say he had a talent for them is the understatement of the century. He's that good. I wasn't surprised there were quite a few overlaps between making a trap and crafting a seal, as both required the imagination and creativity necessary and the ability to piece it all together. He was shaking his head at that point. If only it would be acknowledged as such. What do you mean? I asked, dreading his answer. There's no easy way to say this, he mused, the kid is ostracized. Pretty much any adult he interacts with treats him like shit, no doubt blending the kid and the monster residing in his seal into one entity. This wouldn't necessarily be a problem if not for the children unconsciously mirroring their parents' behavior, if they are even allowed to get near him to begin with. As you can imagine, the result of this is that he doesn't have a single friend to his name. Some of the clan kids tolerate his presence, probably because their parents aren't morons and taught their kids better. But peer pressure at that age is nothing to scoff at. Those pranks of his I mentioned are, for the most part, aimed at people who slighted him in some fashion. Some would credit that to a vindictive streak in the kid. But I don't think that is really the case. I think it's just a means for him to cope, to turn a sad experience he suffered at the hands of someone into a happy one, with the probably intended side effect of excluding the people who wronged him in a similar fashion. Also, it attracts attention towards him, which he's starved of, so he might already be at a point where he's willing to draw the bad kind of attention rather than getting none at all, he surmised, and I couldn't argue with that. It made too much sense for it not to be true. Basically, my brother continued, the kid only has a few people in the village who treat him like a person rather than a plague, that ramen chef and his daughter among them. Although, it might be because he's their best customer, he added with a smirk. Sometimes I wonder if the kid eats anything besides ramen. Tuki, I spurted out, realizing that I hadn't been there for a bowl or ramen since Kushina's death. She was the one who dragged me and Minato there nearly daily to worship the best food ever made, as she liked to put it. Yeah, how did you know? It was Kushina's favorite. Ah, he said, scratching his cheek, that makes a sort of sense, I guess. After a short pause he continued, the sole other positive relationship the kid has is with the third. He calls him old man, the cheek of that kid, he said laughing. Hearing that conjured a soft smile on my lips. Kushina was the same, not caring for titles or social standing. Sobering up a moment later, he said, the troubling thing is, I'm pretty certain this all is by design. I know for a fact that at least 3 people came back from guarding him and informed the Hokage about the worrying degree of isolation Naruto had to endure without effect. Well, that may not be entirely true, to be fair. The ones who brought it up were barred from taking that mission again, and the next day the Hokage gave Naruto a short visit. I think they're conditioning him, limit positive relationships with him to a scant few, and he'll latch onto those that remain that much harder. Eventually coming to consider them as his most precious people, willing to do anything to make them happy, I concluded. They were doing the same thing to him my father had done to me, just without the means of Kotoamatsukami. If I didn't already have a plan in motion already that, as an unintended consequence, would result in getting my Naruto out of that situation, I would be on my way to have words with Hiruzen, heated words with some sprinkling of fire and carnage. Yeah, pretty much, he agreed. Where is he living? I asked. The grimace at the question on my brother's face was telling, surely he has a caretaker. He is still just a kid, even though our village seems to forget that quite often. Tell me about it, he said, bemused, but unfortunately not. He's on his own. And as I understand it, the only reason he isn't living in the orphanage until his graduation, as is usually the case, goes back to some kind of incident. I'm not privy to the details since the incident predates my joining of ANBU. I only know whatever happened was enough for the Hokage to give him his own 2-room apartment on the eastern edge of the civilian district. You mean to tell me he resides in that rundown part with all those abandoned warehouses? Is there even anyone living there? Not really, he shrugged, it makes keeping an eye on him easier. What he implied in that statement without outright saying it was that it also made it harder for him to interact with anyone. Thank you for telling me, little brother. Don't sweat. He stopped mid-sentence. Something isn't right, he said, worried, swaying back and forth. It took him glancing at the half-full teacup in front of him before glancing up at me to press out, what have you done? With the last of his strength as his body threatened to fall over the Chibudai. If he was surprised at my eyes being closed as I moved to catch him, I couldn't tell, and he was certainly no longer in any condition to voice it. Softly maneuvering him by his shoulders, I placed his head into my lap and started caressing his head. A croak escaped his throat. If you are wondering why I have killed you, then the answer is that you are a traitor putting the village above the welfare of the clan. You are also too dangerous to allow to live. Your eyes in particular have proven too dangerous to be left in the wrong hands. I also have a need for them. You were also in the way. My real target happens to be the subversive elements who have taken over the Uchiha clan. Their transgressions are too numerous to count. Some I could have found it in me to forgive, but when their actions, even if only by accident, negatively impacted Naruto, their lives were forfeit. A foregone conclusion with me as their judge, jury, and executioner. Do not worry, Little brother, I have no intention to exterminate the whole clan. Some will be allowed to live in order to make up for the clan's crimes. It will be a chance the clan was underserving of as we tie our fates to someone else. I will make sure this second chance is not squandered, and it will eventually lead to a stronger and better Uchiha clan arising from the ashes, residing in the shadows of something even greater, I explained. Don't fight it. It is futile. The poison I used was a special concoction of my own making. It will blast right through whatever little protection the poison resistance training you received as ANBU gave you. Once ingested and the onset time passes, you die, no exceptions. The poison is slowly suffocating you as your lungs stop working and your heart stills and makes you drift into a dreamless sleep before it is over. I tried to make your death as pleasant as possible. Lamenting, I added, it is ironic. It was me who first held you when you came into this world, and it will be me who holds you when you leave it. Am I not a good, dutiful sister, little brother? I raked my fingers one last time through his hair when I noticed his heart had stopped beating and he was already dead. I bowed down and gave him a kiss on his forehead, whispering, "Sleep well," before I sat upright again. I then removed his head from my thighs, unwilling to risk exposing myself to an attack from him somehow clinging to life, faking his death. Patiently waiting for an opportunity to strike, I kept my eyes closed. Tracing his face, I found his eyelids and pulled them apart as I went to work and removed both of his eyes. Only after I held them in my hand did I open my eyes, Sharingan ablaze to look at him one last time, burning his sleeping form into my mind. For a brief moment, I regretted that I couldn't have taken the risk of going through his memories. Getting confirmation of some of my theories would have been nice. In case I was right, learning what the village was up to would have been even better. Pumping more chakra into my eyes, I advanced them to my eternal Mangekyo and called forth the first stage of my Susanoo. I handed over my brother's eyes to one of his limbs and directed it to implant them within itself. This took only a second, immediately after which I dismissed the chakra construct. It was a risk to do this in the Uchiha district, but I would need Koto Amatsukami shortly, and I was hoping a second set of eyes with the same power might strengthen it somehow. This being the first time I possessed eyes with duplicate abilities, I had no prior experience of what the end result might be. It didn't take long for those eyes to settle, and a wave of power ran through me, although it was nowhere near what I had felt with my Naruto's eyes even though they weren't promoted to their Mangekyo stage. It was a similar boost to what I had received from my father's eyes. Certainly nothing world-shattering, but nothing to scoff at either. I reached under the Chibudai and withdrew a sealing scroll, and unfurled it on the floor right next to my brother. Grabbing his hip, I proceeded to roll his body over atop the scroll, and by applying some chakra made it disappear in a puff of smoke. I rolled up the scroll and walked to Shoji leading into the house. Glancing back over my shoulder, I took one last look at the Uchiha district in all its glory, immersed in the red light of the setting sun, a scene depicting the state of the clan better than 1,000 words possibly could have. I didn't linger and returned back into the house. I had cut it rather close with Shiwui. There was not much time left until the start of the clan meeting set to take place right after sundown. Nonetheless, it could not have been helped. If I had taken care of him any earlier, his sudden disappearance might have been noticed and spoiled my plan, which I obviously couldn't allow. I made my way to my room and stripped down to my underwear, discarding my apron, blouse, and plum skirt onto the floor. I wouldn't need those clothes, the ones my progenitor and husband had made me wear, any longer. They were a symbol of my oppression, designed to show off nothing more than my departure from my life as a shinobi. I was more than happy to finally be rid of them. Tonight called for something special, something appropriate to be worn on such a joyous occasion. Opening my wardrobe, I knew just the thing. I obviously couldn't go there in anything resembling a combat outfit since it would give the game away, so I settled for the next best thing. I reached for a black kimono adorned with a flower motif consisting solely of an intricate pattern of higanbana. The scarlet flower is associated with final goodbyes. According to legend, These flowers grow wherever people part for good, and they are said to serve the dead as a guide through samsara. The latter was the reason I had commissioned the kimono 8 years ago. It was made by the finest seamstress in the village using only the best materials, knowing full well Kushina would need all the help she could get to find her way to eternal peace. Today the other meaning would be at the forefront of my mind. The fine silk felt even better on my skin than I remembered. Stepping in front of my full-length mirror, the kimono fit perfectly, just like the last time I had worn it. I took a moment to admire the floral pattern, consisting of one large higanbana on the back. Sprouting from it were 4 dark green tendrils, one trailing along each arm in a wavy line, whereas 2 remaining ones formed a double helix pattern around my legs. Furthermore, there were 2 more large higanbana on the inside of the tyu furicid, so that when my arms were crossed in front of my stomach, it hid the flower pattern from being seen from the front, making it look as if it was black in its entirety. The tyu furicid would take me a few minutes to get reacquainted with. It definitely wasn't the most practical thing to wear in a fight, should it come to it. Despite that, I was sure I could manage. That only left my hair. Wearing my long hair straight didn't pose a problem for a housewife, in contrast to a kunoichi in a fight. Back in the day, when I was still active, I would braid it into a single braided fishtail to keep it out of my field of view, but just like my old combat attire, I couldn't wear it without arousing suspicions. As a result, I settled for a plaited low bun. It wasn't nearly as suitable to wear with a kimono as a nihongami would have been, but it was far more practical. I put all my sealing scrolls containing my equipment in the back of my scarlet obi, and removed a tile from the floor of my wardrobe. It gave way to a wooden case I removed from the secret compartment. Placing it onto my bed, I opened it, and found its contents exactly as I left it earlier this morning as I prepared it. Several vials filled with freshly mixed fast-acting paralyzing poison that needed a few hours exposure to air for its full potency to unfold. The box also contained a few hundred of the finest Senbon money could buy. They were fashioned out of bone, and specifically treated to add liquid-absorbing properties, making them ideal as a tool for delivering poison. I spent a few minutes carefully dipping them into the poison and watched them soak it up, resulting in a slight discoloring of the Senbon, a visible representation that they were ready to be used. When I was done preparing them, I corked up the vials, closed the lid on the box, and sealed it all up in one of my scrolls. Also housed within the box were 2 holsters, which I strapped to my underarms and filled with Senbon. As a finishing touch, I used the last few remaining poison Senbon and decorated my bun with them. After one last glance in the mirror, I decided then and there this would be the outfit I would wear the first time Naruto would lay eyes on me. It would undoubtedly leave an impression. The next step in my plan warranted my presence during the clan meeting that would begin shortly. I left the house and made my way to the Naka shrine. It had been a long time since I had last set foot in it. Entering through the front gate, I walked into the main hall, and was surprised to find the 7th tatami from the far right was untouched. Even though it wasn't required for me to be the first to arrive, since I simply couldn't have expected this occurrence with any reliability, it was a pleasant surprise nonetheless that would make things easier. I removed the tatami and the sealing stone atop the entrance, and proceeded to the secret underground bunker where the stone tablet was located. The most well-kept secret of the Uchiha clan. Walking up close, I activated my Sharingan, and the parts decipherable with it appeared. I must have read them hundreds of times, especially the part depicting how one could obtain the Mangekyo Sharingan. To see the truth of all creation without obstruction, one must first witness true despair. It was oddly unspecific, just like every other line written on it. It resembled a riddle more than true instructions, and left a lot of room for interpretation. For example, witness true despair when it would be more correct to read experience true despair. Unquestionably, a not insignificant number of my ancestors took that meaning literally and inflicted cruelties on people to bear witness to their despair. This was undoubtedly the source of the implacable hatred some clans felt towards us and cling to until this very day. It was a worthless slab of stone whose meaning only became clear in retrospect, and Fugaku and the elders paid it far more attention than it was due. This was especially true since no actual worthwhile information about our eyes could be found anywhere on it. Still, I was curious about what else I could decipher with the eyes I had gained in the meantime. I wondered if those words would also keep me away from this place when I understood their true meaning. Seeking stability, one god was divided into yin and yang, these opposing two acting together to obtain all things in creation. When someone who possesses the power of samsara approaches the moon, an eye will open that is reflected on the moon in order to grant the eternal dream. These were the two lines that stood out among the new information I learned, and I had no idea what to make of them. Sighing, I cut the stream of chakra to my eyes, and they receded to their normal state. It was time to set the stage for phase 2 of my plan. I removed one sealing scroll from my obi and unrolled it to its full length on the floor perpendicular to the stone slab. Subsequently, I walked a few steps until I stood next to the first seal with one foot. Taking half a step with my other foot, I lowered myself down vertically, bending my knees until I could touch the array and unsealed its contents, all the while taking great care that my furuset didn't touch the ground. In front of me appeared a small chabudai, a pot filled with water, a kyusu, an assortment of different tea in small bowls, and a large tablet taking up half the space filled with teacups on top of chataku. With another touch, I activated the heating seal at the bottom of the water pot. I raised myself from my kneeling position and walked a few steps to the next seal and repeated the whole process 11 more times. By the time I was done, the first people had arrived. Most couldn't hide their surprise at seeing me here. Even so, no one approached me, trying to silently sat their curiosity until Yuka came down the ladder. She was the eldest granddaughter of Elder Kato, one of the most ardent supporters of my late progenitor's policies, and a close friend of Fugaku. Despite that, she, like my late brother, had cultivated a personality that offended the sensibilities of her family and most of the clan. How could she not, with her happy and bubbly personality? There was talk to replace her as the heir of her branch of the family with one of her younger siblings or cousins. It likely would have happened if not for her talent as a kunoichi and the prestige she had earned the clan by breezing through the opposition at the last Chunin exam held in Konoha. Without showing the whole village that she had more than earned her promotion, she undoubtedly would have already lost her position. The girl, even though not quite at Azumi's level, was still one of the few bright sparks remaining within the clan. She was accompanied by her older friend Nagi, a stern and silent girl who, on more than one occasion, was called Yuka's shadow. It was an apt description since they were rarely seen apart even before Yuka had been promoted, and they had formed their own team with two other Chunin. Makoto-sama, she happily exclaimed, her bouncing step coming to a halt in front of me. What are you doing here? Why, am I not welcome? I asked back in a no-nonsense manner that had her visibly recoil. Struggling for words, that's not, what? I was only teasing, I said, ending her struggle with a smile playing on my face. I am here because, after my father's death and the difficult situation we find ourselves in, I deemed it necessary to show my support to my husband and the clan. I kept my repulsion at calling Fugaku that to myself with practiced ease. Oh, she faltered. It was hard not to notice her disappointment. It was unsurprising, since she was one of the most likely candidates to oppose what the clan was attempting to do. That was a position that could be quite dangerous, because everything that was discussed here could easily be construed as treason. Thus, any dissenter, or even people who simply showed reluctance to get behind the proposed idea, were immediately suspect and faced with increased scrutiny. It required a careful balancing act. The instant she went over the line, she would be neutralized. The last thing this little conspiracy needed was someone tattling to the Hokage. It was too bad for Fugaku that if I was right, it had already happened, and directly under his nose, too. I could use your help with the tea, I said.